Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I just want to say it's a real honor to be here, to be invited by VIRK for their 15th anniversary, to give me the opportunity to speak about some of the work we're doing in Canada, myself and my colleagues in Canada, in this area of inclusive employment for persons with disabilities. So I'm really going to speak about a number of different projects we've been doing in this space that are all tied together with various themes that really focus on employers and their capacity that they need to build up to be able to do a good job of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, with a particular focus on the employment of persons with disabilities. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the logos we have here. I'll be speaking a little bit further down in my presentation about an initiative we just got funding for from a federal funding agency called New Frontiers in Research Fund. It's a transformation stream. We were very fortunate to get 6 years of funding for a social innovation laboratory that we were tasked to try to make a bigger impact on the employment of persons with disabilities going forward, because to date we haven't been doing a very good job of this in Canada. So I'll speak a little bit about the work we're doing with that initiative. I have also the logos of McMaster University, where one of my principal appointments is, as well as the Institute for Work and Health, which is in Toronto, Canada. And I just want to say I'm so delighted to be able to have a trip to Iceland. It's a beautiful country, very, very unique, and I'm looking forward to doing some sightseeing tomorrow as well, kind of thing. So it's a great opportunity, and I'm just honored to have this opportunity to be here to speak with you today. So there's a number of themes that will hopefully come through in the work that I'm presenting through this talk, but I thought I'd compile them up and bring them to the front end so that you can look out for them, because they're not always going to be maybe that explicit. I'm going to really be talking about disability as a social construction. That's going to permeate throughout all of the work I'm presenting. Thinking about disability not so much in the clinical sense, but in the social sense, that we construct barriers as a society, and we can deconstruct them and reconstruct the world so it's more inclusive. So really going to focus on that when I talk about demand-side capacity building. A lot of the efforts that we've been doing to date in this space, efforts to employ persons with disabilities, have been inadequate. We've unfortunately not made the progress we'd like to have seen in Canada. I'm imagining it's the same in other developed and newly industrialized and underdeveloped countries as well. It's a space that people are challenged to find a good way forward, and hopefully through our approach with turning to the flip side of thinking about the employer capacity will bring up some new opportunities to increase the employment of persons with disabilities, because there's substantial wasted human capital. In fact, as an economist, I've done some work for our federal government, which I'll speak to within the context of my presentation here, to put a price tag on what we're losing out by not being fully inclusive and accessible. And it's quite surprising how big that number is. So I'll give you some details about that study. And the new paradigm that we're really focusing on is about that demand-side capacity, skilling up employers to be able to be adept at equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in their employment efforts, across all aspects of what they're doing. They should be really focusing on taking that disability lens in what they're doing at the organizational level. We really want to target having equality of opportunities in careers, jobs, and work. Work is so fundamental to most people of working age. It defines their identity, it gives them purpose. It's really a human right, and having equality of opportunity in careers, jobs, and work for all people in our society is absolutely critical. So skilling up employer abilities, creating that demand-side capacity, is a really new and innovative way that we're focusing on in Canada. And ultimately, it's really about culture change. Culture change not just within organizations, but culture change in society, that we appreciate the diversity and the uniqueness that each person brings to the table, that we celebrate that diversity, and we realize that celebrating that diversity results in more productivity, more creativity, more opportunities for all of society. It's a win-win, and I really want to emphasize that. And you'll probably see it in the numbers, the monetization of what we're missing out on, to give you a really good sense of what those opportunities really look like. So what's the challenge? Well, persons with disabilities have been excluded from careers, jobs, and work in a substantial way to date. In Canada, they have substantially lower employment rates. I've taken some data here from a survey that we did in 2017 on persons with disabilities. It's quite a comprehensive survey that we do every few years, and so it may be a bit dated, but it's the most recent data we have. So 57% compared to 75% for the working age population. So substantially lower levels of employment. And when they are employed, they're earning substantially less than persons who are able-bodied, so $34,000 compared to $40,000. And that marginalization is compounded for people who have other social locations that put them on the margins. If they're, a racialized minority group, if they're from the LGBT community, if they're recent immigrants, if they're older, those compound that marginalization and further push them to the margins of the labor market. More challenges presented to them in terms of getting involved and actively employed in the labor market. COVID-19 has also exacerbated some of these issues. What we've seen before COVID was that persons with disabilities were the last group of people to be hired. We have quite a serious labor shortage in Canada. I understand you have the same thing here in Iceland as well. Yet very few employers try to tap into that untapped talent pool of persons with disability, even though they struggle to fill key positions within their organization. And so they were the last people to be hired before COVID-19, and they were the first people to be let go. They were the frontline people oftentimes in service positions, such as in retail or the food service sector. So they were the first people to let go. And we're not seeing the recovery that we would like to have seen in that particular labor pool. So we're really challenged to think about how we can do a better job going forward. And the cost of excluding these persons with disabilities from the labor market is substantial, as I mentioned. So huge amounts of wasted human capital, people who can and want to work but struggle to find employment. So there's an urgent need, I feel, for a new paradigm, and we're trying to present that paradigm through our social innovation laboratory that we've just started up with recently. Employment is really transformative for people's lives. It's part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 27, that states that people have a right to work. Yet, to date, the focus that we've seen in Canada, and probably elsewhere as well, is focusing on skilling up workers and getting them job ready. And that is important. I'm not suggesting that we don't do that, but it still has fallen short of finding people good, meaningful, sustainable jobs if they're persons with disabilities. So there's still that untapped potential. Even though these people are ready, willing, and able and skilled to work, the employers just aren't tapping into their talent in the way they should be. And even though employers may be ready and willing, they're still struggling to accommodate these workers. And that's why we feel there's need to skill up employers in helping them do a better job of accommodating workers' needs. Having it part of the way they do business all the time, to think about that diversity, be comfortable with addressing people's different needs. We sometimes call that disability confidence, wanting employers to be disability confident, that they're not afraid of this unknown area of how do I accommodate people with different needs, that they know that there is a solution and that they can do it, and it's a win-win for them. And so we have this unique opportunity for breakthrough change, and hopefully through our social innovation laboratory, we're working very closely with all the stakeholders in this field to find solutions and scale up those solutions across the sector, across Canada. So I have a short video vignette of a person's lived experience, someone who has participated in a training program in Quebec. Quebec, they speak French, so it's a French video, but we do have English captioning for those of you who don't speak French. It's very inspiring to see that this program, which has been developed with the food sector employers in conjunction with labor unions to develop a training program that does have opportunities for persons with disabilities to skill up to work in the food service sector. And this is Dennis's story.
Ici, on est dans la salle inscrite au mon camarade pour voir un an, j'ai commencé formation Kaya ko kunisi nhiều lạc quá, nhiều cuối từ từ asitu kunyao, anon mo apa, anisarasyo ay kusisi sa teresa, vehiculo, wanisini, ni siya ka ganiku, muwak tao hikamasi karani nisyo, yogi ko tutana. Kita kira makan suku nyego kita kono mawakni kita hake mawa hakno kita no mencino akan lama kasira mengikan nenis kusinaku menek teh cukup kam pun informasi isyo cukup ujian ni nuhun Các quốc nạn nhau no Cao ni ra po Se sunak ni zon Cao ni ra sa sakasin Cao ni ra po mi no Ke korok na kakero Susia sta Kata Papa na karen uksir Me sai ka makai Seni Sinakot kakoka po Hawan sorme Me sinyanani Kok na mesanagok Nakakaw ni ko ko sa iskin ko keso na sa. Olo ko sa kaya mamay sa siya po siya. Siya nakawan. May sabay ko ni Jami, may mana, uskan na rin. May sabay siya po.
So I'm not sure if you caught all the details. He has a hearing impairment. He wears a hearing aid. He also has a bit of a speech impediment, and probably congenital issues that he's had all his life. He works for a grocery store chain in Quebec called IGA. He's mentioned that detail there. But you can see the energy and passion that he has, the desire to work, the dedication. Really incredible to just hear about his energy and passion to work, desire to work, and willingness to go that extra mile to do a really great job. But I'm just wondering, most people, would they have hired this person if they came forward showed up for an interview and you had the opportunity to interview them? Oftentimes, employers might think, okay, I'm not sure how to deal with this kind of a person's needs and accommodate their needs, and would shy away from that opportunity, even though once employed, this person's probably the best employee that organization has. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we did for Employment and Social Development Canada. That's our federal ministry that deals with employment issues at the federal level. We did a project where we were tasked to put a price tag on what the potential was if we were fully inclusive and accessible as a society in Canada. And so it's the estimation of those benefits, that potential that hasn't yet been realized. And it's in conjunction with a new law that came into effect called the Accessible Canada Act in 2019. It is our effort to be compliant with the international human rights requirements for persons with disabilities that we ratified in 2010. So this legislation has just come into effect recently, and they're in the process of developing regulations that will be required for employers to comply with. And so part of the task of making new regulations in Canada is that we have to do an impact assessment. It's a cost-benefit analysis to show that the benefits to society outweigh the cost to society. And so this was our effort we were tasked to do that cost-benefit analysis. I'm just showing you the benefit side in the next few slides. So the key question that we were tasked to address was what would be the benefits to Canadian society in a particular reference year. 2017, remember I mentioned that we had a really good survey on persons with disabilities that year that had really rich data for us to use for this study. So what would be the benefits if Canada was accessible and inclusive in all domains relevant to full participation? It's not exclusively about employment, it's about all social domains. We all wear multiple social roles, different hats that we have in our lives, whether it's parenting, family roles, community roles, leisure roles, maybe educational roles, and also a work role. So we consider all social roles in our society in this task of quantifying that potential. And I put that gold bar there because it's a gold standard. It's this counterfactual scenario of what we could have if we did things differently. And we want to move towards that gold standard going forward through the legislation of the Accessible Canada Act. So one of the first things we had to do was just do a scan of what's been done in the past in this area. It's very much an economics-based exercise. We had to look through the economics literature to see who has done little pockets of analysis to identify what the potential was in different facets of our society. So we need to develop a conceptual framework because nobody had done this before. So it was a bit of a black box for us at the front end, but there was lots of pieces of work that we found that we could piece together to identify these 14 domains. And the way these 14 domains work is they're supposed to be comprehensive of all the areas that might be impacted by this new legislation, and just trying to make them distinct and mutually exclusive so we weren't double counting things. You know, the world's very much interconnected, but our exercise needed to compute unique costs in different facets of our society. So these are the 14 domains. I've highlighted in red a couple of key ones: the output and productivity potential by having a more fulsome employment of persons with disabilities in the labor market, and then the quality of life and social role engagement domain as well, which is about the value we have as individuals, as humans, being social animals, to be participating very actively in the various social roles that we find relevant in our lives and we want to be part of. That's what quality of life is about in terms of its social construction, that we get value out of being active citizens in various facets of our society. So we try to quantify that as well. And this is just another way of framing it. I know the print's probably quite small. It's the same 14 domains with that gold standard research question that we're trying to answer that's in the center of it all, really tasked to trying to figure out what is that counterfactual world look like. And then ultimately we want to think about how do we get there. But we're at this front end just trying to quantify that potential that's there. And this is a summary table of what we found. I'll walk you through it very quickly. So the total benefits that we've identified just for 1 year, that 2017 year where we took our data from, the benefits were substantial. We estimated it to be $338 billion. That is 17.6% of our GDP in Canada. And that's just 1 year's of benefit, so almost 20% gains from being fully inclusive and accessible. And we're not going to get there tomorrow, but we really want to work towards that direction of reaching that society where we will be fully inclusive and accessible, and capture some of those benefits for the persons with disabilities who are losing out, but also for all of society, because there's lots of win-wins. The labor market component itself is 3.2% of GDP, or $62.2 billion. And then I've also put some high-level clusters in the table itself, the various categories that we've identified, taking those 14 domains and clustering them up a bit tighter into bigger chunks. Quality of life and social role engagement, you'll see that in the middle there is 6.9% of that 17.6%. So quite a substantial portion just in the values that people get from being active participants in the various social roles that are out there for them to participate in. And we also did a little sidebar exercise for the public sector to show that it's a win for the public sector as well. Just in reduced dependency on social transfers, reduced dependency on welfare, social assistance, the administrative costs of those programs. They're all revenue that's saved for the government that can then be redeployed for other activities, more value-added, productive activities, rather than having people dependent on the state for transfers, and give them the agency to work in the labor market, to do meaningful stuff with their lives, to have the capacity to be consumers, because most of our social safety net programs are substantially below the poverty line, and people struggle to survive with those programs. So they're not ultimately doing very well being dependent on the social programs. But the government will benefit as well by having more resources to deploy to other activities because of our society being fully accessible and inclusive. So there's a win-win, not for just employers, but and for persons with disabilities and their families, but also for the public sector. So I want to talk next about our new initiative, our Social Innovation Laboratory. VRE means right. So IDEA is our English acronym, Inclusive Design for Employment Access. We call it a social innovation laboratory because we're trying to do things differently. We're really focusing on social policy, working very closely with our partners in what I describe as a knowledge to practice initiative, where we want to base decision-making in the public sector, in the policy arena, with employers, that's evidence-informed, but it's very, very applied what we're doing. So our partners are very actively involved in the research process, and we're trying to be innovative and solution-driven. So in this slide, I have a bit of an overview of our organizational structure. We have what we describe as incubator hubs. They are just entry points for that knowledge to practice work that we do. And we have 5 of these incubator hubs, really focused on different facets of entry into kind of that knowledge to practice inquiry. I won't go through all of them, but they're all connected to each other, so they're not siloed activities. Ultimately, what we're doing has to be really dovetailed with the various facets of knowledge that we're generating and the solutions that we're generating, because ultimately it has to serve the benefits of the stakeholders, the employers who need to build up that capacity. So whether they're thinking about their workplace systems and partnerships, or some of the wraparound employment supports that are needed for persons with disabilities to be able to work, or sometimes it's about technologies, helping students transition into the labor market. Those are all different entry points, but they all have to fit together to make a whole that works very coherently. And what we describe our methodology as being a signature methodology because it's very different than some academic exercises. We're very driven by priority areas that are really urgent, in need of understanding and knowledge. So we start off with a very deliberative process at the front end, working very closely with our stakeholders to identify what the priority issues are. We then start scanning the environment to see what promising practices are already out there, or evidence bases that we can gather and synthesize. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we really want to be building on what's already being done out in the field that has promise, and then identify how we can generalize some of those promising practices to a larger constituency across the sector or possibly across the country. Stakeholder consultations are an important part of that process at the front end, doing some experience mapping, helping identify priorities, rapid prototyping through co-design. Co-design is a process we really embrace. We really want our stakeholders to be part of that solution generating process, and then implementing and evaluating at the local level, small scale trials before we scale up across the country. So a lot we're doing there in a very short period of time, 6 years we've been given funding for, where we are to make a substantial impact on the employment of persons with disabilities. And we've actually committed to trying to make a 5% increase in the outcomes in terms of employment outcomes for persons with disabilities over that 6-year time period of our funding. Outputs, impacts, and measures that we're really targeting for persons with disabilities, clearly improved employment outcomes, but also increased security, independence, and agency. Really important that they have the agency to live a more fulsome life as consumers, as workers, having housing security, food security, and just a sustainable employment opportunities for them. Employers, we obviously want to improve their equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility skill sets, but ultimately it's about improving their operational performance. And then on the academic side, we're trying to increase people's academics' abilities to do this co-designed approach to research, really working very closely with stakeholders. Not all disciplines do that, and we feel it's really important for us as academics to be more closely in tune with what's happening out in the field and working closely with those stakeholders to find solutions. If we're doing applied social policy research, you can't do it without the stakeholders being actively involved in the process, at least not in a meaningful way. And then for the public sector, reducing poverty and dependency, and hopefully making Canada a leader in this space of inclusive employment. And our target of 5% increase in employment of persons with disabilities in Canada would amount to about 125,000 more persons gainfully employed. Here is just a slide with all of our key partners that joined us at the front end when we first put in our proposal. We've had a large number of organizations come forward joining us since we put our proposal together, including various governments at the provincial and federal level. It just seems the timing is right, and lots of people are really keen to get on this agenda and do a better job of including persons with disabilities in the world of work. And so we're really excited that there's that energy out there to really be part of the process, because we can't do this alone. This is a collaborative effort. Everybody across the country really needs to work together to make this happen in a good way. So some key concepts that are central to our idea and central to what I'm talking about here. So I thought I'd just pull them up and speak to the constructs that I'm referring to, and I've mentioned some of them. Accessibility. We get asked a lot, what do we mean by accessibility? That can be interpreted in different ways. So we describe accessibility as being about how products, services, operational systems, and physical and social environments in the workplace are designed and organized to be free of barriers for all persons, right? So our space is the workplace, so we really want accessibility in the workplace. Another thing that I talk a lot about is universal design. It's maybe a term that you've heard about. It's an approach to designing products, services, operational systems, and environments, both built and social environments, based on simplicity, flexibility, efficiency, that promotes usability for the most diverse range of people possible. So it's a concept that was coined probably back in the 70s and 80s. It's evolved since then. So what we're really focusing on is the next generation of this concept, which is inclusive design. It builds on universal design and takes it a few steps further. So currently this terminology describes methodologies that create products, services, operational systems, environments, and environments for people of all backgrounds and abilities, really thinking about people's social location, their unique characteristics that they have that speak to the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human differences. Inclusive design really focuses on the notion of one size fits one. Universal design is often associated with one size fits all, which is a generic solution, but one size fits one is really about everybody's unique and needs a customized situation for their needs and their abilities and their talent that they have to offer. And universal design really speaks to that flexibility of customizing things for the unique needs of individuals. Disability confidence is a term I probably already mentioned. It's spoken to a lot. I think it originates in the UK. We use that terminology a lot in Canada as well. It's about employers' comfort level with dealing with the need to accommodate different people's abilities. So many people involved in the disability justice world are starting to use this terminology, disability confidence. In our case, we're talking about disability confidence of employers in the workplace. Employers and unions, need to have disability confidence, have the capacity to fully include persons with disabilities in workplaces, and feel comfortable with the idea that it can work and there are solutions. You don't necessarily need to have all the answers yourselves as an employer, but you know that it's possible and you know where to reach out to service providers, whoever might be able to help facilitate the accommodation needs of a particular employee that has the talent that you really strive to accommodate and fit into your organization. Some people also talk about disability capacity, and in the US they talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility maturity, so EDIA maturity. They're all very similar constructs. So a disability confident workplace puts policies into practice to ensure persons with disabilities are included. Belong, that's a really important term, and I'll talk a little bit more about belonging, which is the ultimate goal, and then do not have barriers to employment or promotion. So I'm going to give a bit of insights on a quality of life study that we did for Employment and Social Development Canada, another project we did for them a couple of years ago. This was our first foray into developing a measurement paradigm for quality of life that focuses on social role participation, because a lot of the historical measurement paradigms of health-related quality of life have really focused on health and function as being central to quality of life, whereas we think the construct we're trying to get at and need to measure better is how quality of life is associated with being social animals and socially active in different roles in society in different communities. And so we're trying to develop a measurement paradigm for that, really focused on the needs of persons with disabilities being integrated into the world of work and into other social roles as well. So I'm just going to speak in the next few slides about what we heard from stakeholders, key informants we spoke to are from around the world. These are people who are senior folks in the work disability policy arena. So some highlights of what we heard. We asked them about what accessibility means to them. So they said, accessibility is about equitable access, not just equal access. An individual with a disability may have access to an activity, but that does not necessarily mean that they feel they are included in the activity. So access is maybe the starting point, but not the end goal. A distinction exists between accessibility and inclusion, with inclusion being the end state and accessibility being a process to reach inclusion, right? So a person can feel that the event is accessible and yet they're not feeling accepted or included. And a little bit more about disability inclusion then. So disability inclusion means that all persons are able to benefit from opportunities to the same extent as able-bodied persons and other disabled people. So equality of opportunities to participate actively and be included. A definition of inclusion needs to capture that agency and control that must sit with a person with a disability. So agency and control are critical constructs for the sense of independence and having control over your life. The concept, I've highlighted this last one in red because I really think this really hits the mark very well. This is word for word what we heard from one of the people we spoke to. The concept of belonging comes to mind. Accessibility gets you in the door metaphorically. So if a venue is accessible, you'll get in the door, that's fine. But that's not enough. Inclusion means that you're in the space, but belonging means that you are an integral part of that social fabric of that organization, that activity. And that's where you want to get to ultimately, being an integral, valued part of that organization and what it has to offer, and being part of that team that works to produce the productivity and output and services or products that that organization is focusing on as its key operational outcomes, really being a key part of that process. So I talk a lot about systems. I myself, as an economist, really think about meso-level type of issues, systems-level issues, and I think a lot of the solutions are about systems-level issues rather than thinking about individual case-by-case accommodations, which are important to think about as well. But in order for us to do that in a good way, we need to change the way the systems work. And a good starting point is often the best practice guidance that's developed by different standards organizations. I noticed earlier on in the slide, though I don't speak any Icelandic, that the ISO was mentioned, so the International Standards Organization. We have a similar body that's at the country level in Canada called the Canadian Standards Organization. And I've been working with them on a number of different projects for developing best practices for management systems in workplaces. And one of the first ones we developed was best practices for work disability management systems. It's a CSA standard. It's available to purchase, I think, for about $150 Canadian. There's a link there where to get it. I was the chair of the technical committee that developed that standard, and I'm going to speak a bit about it in the next few slides. Another one I'm involved in is with a federal agency called Accessibility Standards Canada. It was an agency developed exclusively for dealing with accessibility issues, and we just finished up an inclusive employment standard, which is again another management system standard that will be going out for public review, I think, in the next couple of months. And another one we just finished up as well, I was on the technical committee, is on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in the trades. This is the building trades. And it's out actually currently for public review, so you can actually go onto the CSA website and see the draft version of this standard. The building trades are just exploding in Canada. Construction is exploding in Canada. They are desperate for workers. And yet, people who are different, whether women, racialized minorities, persons with disabilities, are just not able to pick up jobs in that field, even though there's a big demand for talent there. And so this is an effort to bring into the fold a broader understanding of the potential of diversity in the trades through various certification and training programs, to think about the different actors in that journey of getting certified for a particular trade and making sure it's open to the diversity of talent that's out there that wants to work in this field. So some areas to target for systems level thinking. Best practices in recruitment, hiring, and onboarding. Obviously, that's the front end, getting that first job maybe when you're transitioning out of school. How can employers do a good job of that transitioning process from school to work? Essential skills for mentorship, coaching, and advancement. Really, really critical. A lot of persons with disabilities, even when they get jobs, they're often stuck their entire careers in entry-level jobs. So really, we need to think about careers, not just jobs for persons with disabilities. Unions play a role as well. So what is their role in inclusive workplaces, in creating inclusive workplaces? Going beyond the built environment when you think about accessibility, creating inclusive work environments is about the social environment as well, not just the built environment. Flexible work arrangements, we've seen with COVID how it can work, working from home. Sometimes that is a great solution for a person who maybe has mobility issues or some other issues with commuting to work, or anxiety issues when they deal with crowded public transit, that kind of thing. So working from home offers a lot of potential for persons who just don't fit into the standard work environment and have challenges commuting. And we know it can work. We've been forced to make it work, and technology has made it happen as well. Why not embrace this now and seize it as an opportunity, as a good way of accommodating some people's needs? Inclusive design or universal design in information systems. Technology is often a barrier. There's great potential in technology, but if not used correctly, it can create incredible barriers for persons with disabilities and others as well. Implementing robust disability management systems, and I'll speak a little bit about that in the next few slides. Weaving inclusive design, universal design into procurement and the supply chain. I really believe in taking that inclusive design, the disability lens, into everything organizations do, including procurement and the supply chain. When you're purchasing products and services, when you're dealing with the supply chain of sourcing materials, think about how you can build in inclusivity into all of those activities, really building it up into the capacity of your whole sector, if at all possible. And leaders in that field who are large organizations who have command over those supply chains can make a difference and get everybody into gear to ensure that inclusivity is part of the expectation of anybody you procure services or products from. Accessibility planning and reporting, a roadmap for change. So doing this is a journey. And so it doesn't happen overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow. So one of the expectations actually of our new Accessible Canada Act is that you make a formal plan of how you're going to get there to that gold standard I had mentioned. What is your plan? Document that plan. Post the plan on your website. Have persons with disabilities review it so they can give you feedback. Is it realistic? Report back on progress being made on a periodic basis. That's a formal process unto itself that needs some support. And then continual improvement. I'm a firm believer in continual improvement. You may take some small steps at the front end, and you may make good progress over time, but there's always room for improvement. So thinking about how you can always do better is just the natural process of how you do business. So the CSA standard that I mentioned on work disability management systems, it provides organizations with guidance on how to incorporate best practices in work disability management into their day-to-day operations, into their systems. It provides a broadly applicable consensus-based. At the table of the technical committee, we had labor, we had industry, we had service providers, we had government, we had academics. It was a consensus-based approach. We all had to agree upon what those best practices need to encapsulate, and it was evidence-informed as well. So we did our research to make sure that we took the best practices from a knowledge base that was out there to tap into. And it's broadly applicable because it's meant for any organization. It's something all organizations actually need to do, whether they're for-profit, not-for-profit, public sector, private sector, small business, whatever sector you are in. So this standard is meant to be broadly applicable. And it's meant to be also comprehensive across all health needs, whether physical or mental health needs. So it's not focusing on a specific set of health issues. It also provides some guidance on recruitment, hiring, and onboarding of workers with disabilities. Most organizations feel it's only their obligation to deal with their existing employees' health needs, but we feel they should be addressing all of the needs of the labor force, particularly at the front end when they're recruiting, hiring, and onboarding, to think about how do we accommodate people at that front end when we're trying to tap into the talent of what's in the labor market. And then there's some supporting materials provided as well in the annexes to help implement the standard in different contexts. So systems approach, I've mentioned that. Traditionally, the approach taken for work disability management has been assigning it to a person. It was a person's role, somebody who called themselves, I'm the disability manager, or maybe it was assigned to somebody in human resources. And large organizations might actually have a department they call Occupational Health and Safety Department that takes on the disability management task. And some organizations in Canada, even large organizations, farm it out to external service providers. I think out of sight, out of mind, let somebody else deal with it. It's very reactive. They deal with issues, put out fires as they arise. When somebody is off sick and they need help getting back to work, that's when all these services kick in. And that's sometimes a bit too late. You should be thinking it on a proactive basis, thinking about disability prevention is what I call it, preventing health conditions from becoming disabling. If you're proactive, you can address people's needs as they arise, rather than waiting until they're off work sick and need some support getting back into the world of work. So the systems approach really assigns roles and responsibilities across the organization. Everybody plays a role in disability management, different roles. Supervisors and managers play a role, HR plays a role, your colleagues play a role as well. So everybody has a particular role to play. And it's all spelled out in this standard what those different roles are. And the systems approach looks at inputs, process, outputs, and feedback. It's based on this continual improvement process. So you need to measure and evaluate, making sure you're making progress as you're trying to advance the sophistication and the effectiveness of your disability management system. So a management system then is a formalized framework of policies, processes, procedures used by an organization to meet its objectives. It's meant to be documented, tested, step by step, really ensuring smooth functioning across the life of the organization. It's supposed to be very clear and consistent and integrated with all organizational activities. And it's meant to be proactive. And that's why I sometimes use the word work disability prevention, preventing health conditions that arise from being disabling. And as I mentioned, it's based on the continual improvement process. We call it Plan, Do, Check, Act is the acronym PDCA. It's central to most management system standards, and most of the CSA management system standards that I've been involved in are based on this continual improvement process. Some principles that underlie this particular standard is meant to be worker-centered. It's focused on the worker. It's a case-by-case, contextualized biopsychosocial approach, really maintaining work engagement. Each person is unique and different. Even if they may have that same health condition as another colleague, their social location is different. So you really have to focus on the specific worker. Remember, one size fits one, case by case and contextualized. It's important to also view disability not exclusively through a healthcare lens. Disability, as I mentioned earlier on, one of my themes was it's a social construction. We build barriers by the way we construct the world, and we can reconstruct that world. We can retrofit things, and hopefully going forward, we build from first principles to be inclusive, right? So really important to take it out of that healthcare paradigm exclusively and think about, certainly we have to tend to people's healthcare needs, but that's not going to be the solution if there's barriers in the workplace for people's different abilities. Some people's health may compromise their health and function permanently, and they might have a residual impairment after an injury or illness. How can we make sure that that doesn't become a barrier in the workplace? Work disability management considers the worker's role. It's really important to think about the worker's role and how they can maintain that engagement in that specific role. Their essential duties, the physical and psychological demands of their jobs. The organization and worker are supposed to jointly find these solutions. It's not like it's imposed on someone. It should be worked together, finding those solutions. I always say the best way to go about this is you ask the person. Some of my colleagues call it ATP as an acronym. The person probably has a good sense of what they need to make work for them. And so get them involved and work with them to find those solutions. We use the term worker as well. I want to emphasize that rather than employee, because there are other people in the work site that don't always have that label of an employee. Sometimes they come from temporary agencies or consultants or contract workers. And we feel that the employer should be responsible for everybody who's on that work site. They can make the difference, making sure the environment is conducive to active, meaningful engagement of all the people on the work site. So all workers, not just employees. The biopsychosocial approach I've mentioned, we draw from the World Health Organization's ICF, International Classification of Functioning and Disability. In this framework, as you're probably familiar with it, health and function impairment might be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for disablement. Really critical are the environments, the built and social environments, as well as the person's personal characteristics. So really, health and function, a starting point when it's compromised, but doesn't necessarily have to be disabling, because we can make a difference as an employer, as a society, by building the world so that it's inclusive of people's health and function and their abilities and their talent. We also focus on the working life perspective. An employer has a responsibility, not just at a point in time, but over that whole employment journey that worker has with them. So from recruitment, hiring, and onboarding at the front end, job continuity and advancement on through till exit, wherever they might go to another job, to retirement. That employer has a responsibility throughout that life cycle and making sure it's the best possible journey that worker can have, by being cognizant of their needs and revisiting their needs, because life changes, people's health changes, their abilities may change as they age, and accommodating those needs as those changes arise, and being in tune with the workers' growth and progress in the organization, helping them move forward in their careers throughout that life journey with that employer. So this slide has a bit of framework of what the different modules are in that standard. The core parts of it, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, are that continual improvement process. That's a core part of the standard. A number of annexes helping with the implementation. As I mentioned, that's available from the CSA website. And I understand these PowerPoints will be made available to people. I've put in hot links for a lot of these things if you're interested in actually linking into some of those websites. The last piece I want to talk about is some work we did recently for Employment and Social Development Canada on skills development barriers for persons with disabilities and promising practices to address them. This was something that one of our departments within the Employment and Social Development Canada, called Skills for Success, is really interested in thinking about how they can help support better opportunities for skills development for various marginalized groups. Our task was with persons with disabilities. They also look at Indigenous populations, LGBTQ+, women, racialized minorities, recent immigrants. So our task was to think about how we can do a better job as a society, through workplaces, through wraparound supports, through educational systems, how we can do a better job of creating opportunities for persons with disabilities to develop the skills that will promote their talent and get them into sustainable, meaningful, well-paying jobs. And one of the things that came through when we spoke to a number of key informants around the world, from Australia, from the US, from the UK, in Canada as well, was the consistent theme that came up about employers playing a key role in skills development. They have a strong obligation to help facilitate skills development, and you'll see through some of the details of what we heard how that works. Okay, so the three questions that we were asked to address was, what are the main barriers faced by persons with disabilities in this area of skills development? What are some of the proven promising practices and avenues to address some of those barriers? And then we were doing this project just at the tail end of COVID. How can we address some of the barriers that have been created by COVID and post-pandemic kind of issues, getting people back into the labor market, getting them back into opportunities where they can develop some of their skills. So here's a summary of what we heard, 8 kind of themes. I'll just walk through them quickly. Mainstreaming training opportunities. Oftentimes, persons with disabilities are streamed off into ghettos of sorts, educational ghettos, where they're not challenged to think about work as a career for them or as an outcome, a meaningful outcome for them. And it was a strong sentiment that everything should be in part of the mainstream for persons with disabilities, along with everybody else, so that we mainstream all training opportunities. Contextualize skills training. Really, the best place to get skills is on the job, right? So contextualize them in realistic, real-world opportunities in the workplace when at all possible. Value different learning styles. You have to teach people in different ways using multimodal and pedagogical, andragogical techniques to ensure that people's different learning styles are addressed. Some people are more visual learners, some people are more auditory learners, some people like numbers, some people like diagrams. Think about those diverse learning styles and build that into the curriculum. Promote barrier-free hiring approaches as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the subsequent slide. Promote on-the-job training opportunities. Really critical that employers create these opportunities for skills training on the job. Classroom setting is fine, but the real world setting is much more realistic and more conducive to learning real world skills. Consider the whole person approach. We heard a lot about this. Work can only work for people, not just persons with disabilities, but particularly persons with disabilities, when everything else in their life is in place. They need housing security, they need income security, they need food security, they need services, they need transportation that's accessible. Everything else needs to be in place before work can be a realistic opportunity for persons with disabilities. And employers have that responsibility to think about the whole person and help facilitate the needs of the person across their life needs. And a lot of cutting-edge employers, particularly in the technology sector, are taking this approach, really thinking about how can we facilitate you finding, secure housing when you're moving to a new city to work in the tech sector in Silicon Valley in the US or in Canada. We have our own counterpart in Southern Ontario. People are moving for a new job, maybe their first time away from home. How can we support some of those processes? Thinking about the whole person rather than just their needs at work. So really critical to think about that. Yeah. And then provide training for supervisors, managers, and workers. Skilling up all of the workplace parties. Getting them comfortable with diversity. How do I work with people who have hearing impairments, or sight loss, or communications challenges, who are neurodiverse? We might have a discomfort at the front end, but we have to get over that hump and realize that diversity is exciting. It brings a new perspective to the world, brings creativity to the team when people come to the team with different vision, different lenses of experience that they bring to the table. Really can be a win-win once you embrace that diversity. So provide training for people to get past that apprehension of how do I deal with this kind of person or that kind of person. Support career mentorship and advancement. We're thinking about careers, not just jobs. Okay, I'll just go quickly over some of the details that we heard in each of these themes. So mainstreaming training opportunities. Barriers exist at all levels of the educational system in Canada, starting from primary school right through secondary and post-secondary. So really thinking about taking that social model of disability and building it into how we build educational systems where everybody is part of the same stream rather than pushing them off to the side into these ghettos where they're really not tasked to be challenged and look for realistic career opportunities, right? Persons with disabilities are not even encouraged oftentimes to think about work as a realistic outcome. Another thing that we've also found is students who have part-time jobs during their educational pursuits do much better once they get into the labor market full-time. And so people who are not had that opportunity to work part-time while they're at school generally don't do as well in their careers as well because they've not developed those skill sets. It's a challenge. I can imagine going right through university, maybe if you go that far to your master's level and at 26, 27, going out there to have a first job, never had that experience. So people who have part-time jobs during their studies do much better. Yet persons with disabilities rarely have that opportunity to have a part-time job. They're rarely kind of tasked or challenged to think about that as a realistic opportunity in the summer or in the evenings or on the weekend. And just really integrating them into the mainstream and giving them the value that they can do a job and can have those challenges and meet those challenges rather than pigeonholing them to some low expectations, entry-level positions once they finish their studies. Contextualized skill training. Soft skills were mentioned, accessibility skills were mentioned, technical skills were mentioned, but focusing solely on skills of persons with disabilities seemed to be misdirected by most of the people we spoke to. They were telling us that there's lots of talent out there amongst the persons with disabilities. They're as diverse as able-bodied people, and their talents cover the spectrum across a distribution, much like able-bodied persons. So to think that they're not employed because they don't have the right skill set is sometimes misdirected. Sometimes it's about the barriers that exist to tap into their talent, and those barriers are with the employer. So it's better to explore job matching based on existing skill sets that they already have, and then skilling up the individuals, rather than skilling up individuals without having a particular opportunity in mind. Oftentimes we see some of these folks that have been going through 3, 4, 5 different training programs and never getting a job in the field that they were trained for. So skilling up can be misdirected if it isn't targeting particular opportunities and jobs and careers for them. Valuing accommodation and different learning styles, really critical to accommodate people's different learning styles. Think of them as gifts. They're a talent coming to the world with a different way of seeing, different way of communicating, different way of expressing yourself. They're cognitive gifts that can be so effective in jobs. Promote barrier-free hiring approaches. This is a critical front-end part that we've heard a lot about. Some people just don't interview very well. And so what a lot of organizations are doing now is doing task-based assessment processes. Rather than having people talk about what they can do, have them show what they can do. So give them some tasks that's characteristic of the job that they're being entertained for, and let them show you what they can do. Sometimes it can be through an internship for a short period of time. Sometimes it can be a take-home exercise. Sometimes it can be done on site. We're actually doing that with all of the people we're hiring in our social innovation laboratory. And I've heard that many organizations are mainstreaming this process where you're using these task-based assessment processes for all people that you're recruiting, not just persons with disabilities, but particularly persons with disabilities. Some of them just don't interview well, particularly if they're neurodiverse. They're a bit shy, a bit awkward because they've never been taken seriously by the world of work and employers. And so, if you can give them the opportunity to show their talent, that's sometimes the best way to identify what they have to offer as individuals. Promote on-the-job training opportunities. This was spoken to a lot by the people we interviewed. They kept saying the best place to learn skills is on the job. Rather than thinking about doing it in the classroom, whenever possible, do it on the job. One thing that they also spoke about was sheltered workshops. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. In Canada, historically, they developed these ghettos of specialized employment entities that hire only persons with disabilities. They're often highly subsidized by the government. The wages are minimal. They're just free labor for these tasks that are sometimes not very relevant, and some people see them just as respite care for their caregivers, right? And they're trying to do away with these sheltered workshops and mainstreaming employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. Consider the whole person. I mentioned that. Take that whole person approach. Work only works if everything else is in place for an individual. Provide training for all workplace parties. When supervisors and the department are trained, the experiences are phenomenal. And it's not a big undertaking as some might think. That's a direct quote from one of the people we spoke to. So everybody has to get up to speed with equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And then finally, support career mentorship and advancement. Programs fail to look to the future and only address sometimes the immediate needs of an employer. And that's a dead end for persons with disabilities, as it is for anybody. If it's just about getting them a job, that job might not last very long, and they're back into the cycle of looking for work shortly thereafter if there's not career planning built into the process. So focus on careers, not jobs. Career paths may not necessarily be linear, but they should always be progressive. And one of the people we spoke to who works as an employment agency service provider with a focus on persons with disabilities just mentioned, how do we shift out of the idea of celebrating someone in the same position at McDonald's for 25 years to shift that narrative from just employment to career development and growth across the lifespan? So that's the focus we should be taking. And then one of the other things we did was we just collected a whole battery of services, programs, and resources that are out there for employers that we heard about as we were speaking to these experts from around the world. And we were just surprised how much there is out there that maybe lots of people hadn't heard about. So we gathered them up. There's 66 different links that we have in the report. If you're interested in checking it out, it's available on our CRWDP website. It's incredible what's out there. And and just knowing about it is really helpful, because sometimes employers struggle to figure out, well, how can we help the whole person? Where can we turn to for some supports, kind of thing? And there's stuff out there, and you just may not have heard about it. So I've just put down 10 of them, but there's, as I mentioned, 66, several pages of links of things, some of them free to be used by anybody who needs those supports. And then lastly, I want to leave you with another vignette of a person's lived experience. This person currently is working for CIBC. That's an acronym, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. It's one of the biggest banks in Canada. We have 5 national banks. I think it's the biggest or the second biggest one in Canada. He's currently skyrocketing in his career, and a senior disability diversity consultant with this bank, CIBC. But he struggled for people to realize his potential. So I just want you to hear his story. He spoke at one of the conferences we have on an annual basis called Disability and Work in Canada. We do it every year around the International Day of Persons with Disabilities on December 3rd. So we have a stakeholder conference, and we often have people with lived experience speak about their personal experiences.
Living in Toronto, it's great to be back in friendly territory. So it's great to be back in Ottawa. So my name's Tim Rose, and I was lucky enough to be born with cerebral palsy. So I have the use of 2 fingers on my left hand, full vocal range, and that's pretty much it. And I don't care how confident you are, but when you have 2 degrees and you get 78 no's or 78 non-calls, your confidence takes a bit of a hit. And if it hadn't been for the amazing support system I had around me, my wife, my mother, who's a former HR director, and when your mom's a former HR director, it's both a blessing and a curse when you're looking for work. But if it hadn't been for that support system, I don't know where I would be. But the light bulb moment for me happened when I realized that if no one else would see the asset that my disability presented, that I was just going to go out there and show them. So I started my own consulting business called Disability Positive Consulting. And the whole point of that business was to demonstrate the asset that is inherent in people's disabilities. If you think about all the words that are huge in business today, words like innovation, flexibility, thinking outside the box, all these characteristics that we are looking for in employees are all things that I have simply because of my disability. My disability is the root cause of everything that makes me a good employee. It's the work ethic, it's the ingenuity, it's the flexibility, it's the memorability, right? People remember me when I walk into a room. And when you're in sales, that can be a really good thing. I stick in people's heads. Sometimes you don't want to stick in people's heads, but when you do, it's a really good thing. So once that light bulb moment hit for me, and once I decided, okay, this is how I'm going to turn this around. This is how I'm going to turn these last 4 years of struggle and challenge and pain to make it worth it for me. And I did that. And since I've done that, my career has been on a fairly steep upward trajectory.
So, inspiring and very talented person, 2 degrees, has a master's degree, super smart person, but people just didn't realize the potential until he finally got on a track where it just people started realizing, through his consulting business and ultimately in the banking sector that he had a lot to offer. So I imagine if you had a chance to talk to this person, hopefully you would have hired this person, because you can see that he is a pretty smart person and knows how to use his difference to do good and being productive, a contributor to an organization. And he is just skyrocketing his career. He's a high demand speaker, and we have a hard time getting him to come to our conferences because he's so busy. So that's it for me, and thank you very much. That's our website. You can maybe sign up for our newsletter or something like that if you want to stay connected. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking here today.